The world was watching. Millions of eyes locked onto their screens, unaware they were about to witness one of the most electrifying moments in television history. A showdown so intense, so unexpected, that it would redefine the public's perception of a young man who had long been a mystery. At the center of it all stood Barron Trump, stepping into the limelight in a way no one had ever seen before. The cameras rolled and the lights burned bright. The air inside the studio was thick with anticipation. This was not just another interview, it was a test, a battle of intellect, resilience, and unshakable composure. On one side sat Richard Caldwell, the ruthless television host known for dismantling his guests with calculated precision. On the other side sat Barron Trump, a young man who had remained a mystery for years, now stepping forward into the storm. Caldwell had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He had taken down politicians, CEOs, and media giants, and he had every reason to believe that tonight would be no different. But what he did not expect, what no one expected, was that Barron had come prepared not just to answer questions, but to take control of the entire conversation. The host wasted no time, making it clear from the outset that this was a moment of reckoning. America had been waiting for Barron Trump to speak, and now he would have no choice but to define himself before the world. The pressure was immediate, the intensity overwhelming, but Barron remained composed. He understood the stakes. He understood the traps being laid before him. And yet he showed no hesitation. The questions came fast, sharp, and unforgiving. Caldwell framed Barron as an enigma, a young man born into privilege yet shrouded in mystery. The nation had seen him grow up, but they did not know him. That, Caldwell insisted, was about to change. The public deserved to know who Barron Trump truly was. The inevitable topic of privilege arose, a calculated attempt to corner him into either admitting an unfair advantage or denying reality altogether. But Barron, unshaken, offered a response that defied expectation. He reframed the conversation entirely, shifting focus away from birthright and onto personal responsibility. Privilege, he asserted, was not about where one started, but about how one chose to use the opportunities given. A name might open doors, but it did not guarantee success. The studio audience murmured in response. A subtle shift had begun. Caldwell, accustomed to watching his guests falter under pressure, recognized the change. His usual tactics were not working. He leaned in further, pressing harder, introducing the most controversial topic of all, Barron's father. He positioned the question as an unavoidable challenge, one that would force Barron into either blind loyalty or public disapproval. The air in the studio became heavier. The audience knew the weight of the question. If Barron defended his father without question, he would be accused of bias. If he criticized him, the headlines would be relentless. It was a no-win scenario. Yet Barron did not hesitate. He turned the question back onto its foundation, making it clear that no leader, past or present, was immune to scrutiny. He refused to be defined solely by his father's legacy, instead asserting his own independence in a way that few had expected. The audience reacted immediately. Some murmured in approval, others exchanged glances, realizing that something different was happening. Barron Trump was not simply answering questions. He was controlling the narrative. Caldwell sensed it, and for the first time, an unease settled into his expression. Determined not to lose control of the interview, the host pivoted to the subject of politics. The question of whether Barron would follow in his father's footsteps had lingered for years, and now, in this moment, the world demanded an answer. The weight of legacy pressed down on him. Would he enter politics? Would he continue the Trump name in the highest office? Barron took his time. He let the question hang, ensuring that every second of silence amplified its importance. And then, with quiet confidence, he offered a response that was neither a confirmation nor a denial, but something far more significant. He would not enter politics simply because of expectation, nor would he avoid it to satisfy public scrutiny. His path would be his own to choose. The studio erupted in response. The shift in energy was undeniable. The interview, once expected to be a dismantling of a public figure, had instead become a defining moment in his rise. Barron Trump had not been broken under pressure. He had thrived in it. The game had changed. And in that moment, it became clear. Barron Trump had just won the first round. The atmosphere in the studio grew heavier. The first round had not gone as expected. Richard Caldwell, the master of control, the ruthless interrogator, was not just facing resistance. He was facing something he rarely encountered. A guest who was not only holding his ground, but slowly turning the tide of the entire interview. Caldwell knew he needed to act fast. His usual strategy of psychological pressure had failed to rattle Barron. The young man had answered every challenge with poise, every question with an answer that was deliberate, measured, and powerful. But Caldwell had not built his reputation by backing down. He had a second strategy, one that was more ruthless, more direct. If political traps would not work, then personal ones would. He leaned forward, shifting the tone of the conversation, moving from the battlefield of policy and public expectation to something far more intimate: self-doubt. Every great figure, every leader had moments of weakness. If he could find Barron's, if he could expose a crack in his armor, then perhaps he could reclaim control. Caldwell's approach changed. He softened his voice, laced his words with an air of concern, even curiosity. He spoke of pressure, of expectation, of the weight of being a Trump. He pushed the idea of isolation, the burden of being born into a name that meant so many things to so many people. Then, with precision, he introduced the idea of failure. Had Barron Trump ever felt like he had truly failed? Not in school, not in business, but as a person. The question landed like a silent grenade in the room. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the shift in tactics. This was a psychological move. If Barron revealed a personal moment of weakness, he risked looking vulnerable. If he refused to answer, he would be accused of arrogance. There was no easy way out. Barron, however, did not respond immediately. He did something that caught Caldwell off guard. He took his time. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Then, finally, his answer came, and it was not what anyone expected. Rather than listing a single moment of failure, Barron reframed the question entirely. He spoke of failure not as an event, but as a mindset. True failure, he suggested, was not about losing, not about falling short. It was about allowing others to define one's worth. And in that sense, he had never truly failed, because he had never allowed the world to dictate who he was. A ripple went through the studio. Caldwell's expression tensed ever so slightly. He had expected hesitation, regret, something that could be scrutinized. Instead, Barron had turned the question into a statement of power, flipping the concept of failure on its head. The interview was slipping from Caldwell's control. For the first time, the audience seemed to shift their attention away from the host and toward Barron entirely. He was no longer just a guest responding to a seasoned journalist's questions. He was leading the conversation, dictating the pace. Caldwell knew he needed to regain control, and he needed to do it quickly. If emotional pressure wouldn't work, he had one final option: legacy. He shifted again, this time with precision. He acknowledged Barron's intelligence, his composure. But he posed a question that could not be easily evaded, one that forced him to confront the weight of his family's history head-on. If he were not a Trump, would anyone be listening to him right now? A brutal strike, a question designed to dismantle confidence at its core. The room fell silent again, waiting. Even the studio crew barely moved. It was a question that cut straight through privilege, through expectations, through any illusion of individualism. Did Barron Trump matter on his own, or was he merely a reflection of his father's legacy? For a brief moment, Barron seemed to consider it. Then, without hesitation, he answered. He acknowledged the power of his last name, the privilege it carried. But then, with clarity, he made something else just as clear. If he had nothing worth saying, no one would still be listening. The name may have given him a platform, but it was up to him to prove he deserved it. The response landed like a thunderclap. The studio audience erupted. Some people rose to their feet, some nodded in approval, realizing the weight of what had just been said. Barron Trump had not just answered the question. He had owned it, twisted it into something undeniable. Caldwell clenched his jaw, gripping the edge of his desk. The game had changed once again, and he had lost another round. This was not just another interview anymore. This was history in the making. The battle was far from over. But at that moment, for the first time in his career, Richard Caldwell felt something entirely unfamiliar. He was losing, and all of America was watching. The energy in the studio had shifted. Richard Caldwell, once the unquestioned master of televised debate, now found himself grasping for control. Barron Trump had not only held his ground, he had flipped the entire dynamic of the interview. The young man who had long remained an enigma was no longer just answering questions. He was leading the conversation. He had proven that his presence on this stage was not an accident, not a product of name recognition alone. He was there because he had something to say, and the world was listening. Caldwell knew he had to act fast. If he allowed this momentum to continue, this would no longer be his interview. It would be Barron's. He needed a decisive strike, something that would finally push his guest into a position from which there was no easy escape. And so he chose his next move carefully. The conversation shifted once more, this time toward legacy. Not just personal legacy, but political legacy. The Trump name had been a force of division, of controversy, of loyalty and opposition in equal measure. Caldwell saw his opportunity and took it. He framed his question carefully, asking not about Barron's personal ambitions, but about his father's. He asked, in no uncertain terms, whether Barron believed his father had been the right leader for America. The room fell into a deep silence. This was the question everyone had been waiting for. If Barron defended his father outright, he would be accused of blind loyalty. If he expressed doubts, the media would tear the moment apart, twisting it into a story of betrayal. There was no middle ground, or so Caldwell thought. Once again, Barron refused to be trapped. He did not rush his answer. He did not fall into the expected rhythms of political discourse. Instead, he did something entirely different. He turned the focus back onto the American people. He pointed out that his opinion was not what mattered most. What mattered was the voice of the voters, the millions who had made their choice, who had shaped the political landscape with their support or their opposition. The presidency was not about personal judgment, it was about democracy. The response was brilliant. It stripped the question of its intended power. It neutralized the attack before it could gain traction. More than that, it forced the conversation back onto the people, the nation as a whole, rather than keeping the focus on himself or his father. The audience responded immediately. A wave of applause swept through the room, and for the first time, Caldwell's frustration became visible. His tactic had failed. Again. But he was not done. He would not allow this interview to slip through his fingers entirely. If Barron would not falter under political scrutiny, then Caldwell would take one last approach: the future. He shifted gears abruptly. If Barron was so adamant about defining himself, then the question was simple. What did he want? What did he see as his own path? Would he follow his father's footsteps into politics, or would he carve out something entirely different? The tension in the room deepened. This was the question that had been looming over Barron Trump for years. Speculation had run rampant. Would he one day seek office? Would he continue the Trump political legacy or reject it entirely? Barron took a breath. His response was careful but powerful. He did not make a commitment. He did not deny the possibility. He made it clear that his path would not be dictated by expectation, neither by those who wanted him to embrace politics nor by those who wanted him to avoid it. His future, he implied, would be his own to shape. The applause came again, this time even louder. The audience recognized the weight of what had just been said. This was not a young man being pushed into a predetermined role. This was someone asserting his own agency, making it clear that he would not be defined by the expectations of others. Caldwell had run out of cards to play. The psychological traps, the political bait, the legacy questions, none had worked. Barron had countered each with precision, turning every moment into an opportunity to strengthen his own image rather than weaken it. For the first time in his career, Caldwell sat back, exhaled slowly, and acknowledged what had happened. This interview, meant to challenge, to expose, to control, had done something entirely different. It had revealed something the world had never seen before. Barron Trump was not just his father's son. He was his own force. And America was beginning to realize it. The weight of the moment settled over the studio like a storm before the break of dawn. Barron Trump had done the unthinkable. He had turned an interrogation into a defining moment of self-identity. He had not been broken under scrutiny, nor had he crumbled under the pressure of expectation. Instead, he had emerged stronger, more defined, more undeniable. Richard Caldwell, the veteran interviewer, now sat in unfamiliar territory. His usual tactics had failed. His attempts to corner Barron had only strengthened his position. The audience was no longer watching an interview unfold. They were witnessing the rise of a figure who had long been shrouded in mystery. Caldwell's next move had to be calculated. He knew he had lost ground, but the interview was not yet over. If he was to regain even a fraction of control, he needed to step away from the philosophical and political and aim for something more immediate, more tangible. He pivoted. The conversation turned toward public perception. What did Barron think of the way the media had portrayed him over the years? Did he believe he had been unfairly scrutinized, or was it simply the price of being a Trump? This was another trap, one designed to push Barron toward either self-pity or defensiveness. If he claimed the media had been unfair, he would be accused of playing the victim. If he dismissed their coverage as justified, he would be conceding to the narrative that had often painted him as nothing more than a shadow of his father. But Barron had learned well. He did not take the bait. Instead, he acknowledged the power of the media without allowing himself to become a victim of it. He recognized that scrutiny came with public life, that narratives would always be spun in ways beyond his control. But, he emphasized, no headline, no interview, no article could truly define him. Only his actions, his words, his choices, those were what mattered. The response landed like a thunderclap. It was not an evasion. It was not deflection. It was a statement of fact. And for the first time in the interview, Caldwell leaned back, as if absorbing the full realization of what was happening. Barron Trump had not just survived this interview, he was winning it. But Caldwell was not finished yet. If Barron could not be pressured into self-doubt or political traps, there was one last avenue to explore. The question of power. Would Barron Trump ever seek it? Not just influence, not just a voice, but true power, the kind that could shape a nation, that could shift the course of history. The kind of power that came with leading America. The audience knew what was coming. This was the question they had been waiting for. Caldwell, carefully measured, posed it in the most direct way possible. Would Barron Trump ever run for president? The question hit like a lightning bolt. The studio fell silent. The audience barely breathed. This was the moment that could change everything. Barron, as always, did not rush to answer. He let the weight of the question settle over the room. He knew what his words could mean. And then finally he responded. He did not say yes. He did not say no. Instead, he delivered a message far more powerful. Leadership, he suggested, was not about seeking power for the sake of power. It was about responsibility, about standing for something greater than oneself. If the time came, if the moment demanded it, he would not shy away. But he would never step into a role simply because it was expected of him. He would choose his own path. And with that, the studio erupted. The applause was no longer polite, no longer a mere reaction to well-placed words. It was thunderous. It was recognition. For years, Barron Trump had been an unknown figure in the political world, an enigma standing just outside the chaos of public life. But tonight, that changed. He had stepped forward, not as an extension of his father's name, not as a silent heir to a controversial legacy, but as his own man. And Richard Caldwell knew it. He could feel the shift. He had spent decades dismantling public figures, exposing weaknesses, turning interviews into battlefields that left his guests struggling to recover. But this time, the battlefield had been won by the man sitting across from him. Barron Trump had done more than just survive. He had defined himself in front of the entire nation, and America would never look at him the same way again. The atmosphere in the studio had transformed entirely. The balance of power had shifted. Richard Caldwell, once the master of the conversation, was now reacting rather than leading. He had thrown every strategy, every calculated question, every psychological trap at Barron Trump. Yet the young man had not only withstood them, but turned them into stepping stones that elevated him in the eyes of millions watching. Barron Trump was no longer simply a name. He was a force. Caldwell knew he had only one option left: escalation. He had to push further, take the interview into even deeper, more controversial territory. He had to challenge Barron's stance on the very issues that divided America: political power, national unity, leadership in an era of turmoil. If he could not shake Barron personally, he would try to shake him ideologically. He transitioned into the most sensitive topic yet: America's future. He framed his next question not as an attack, but as an unavoidable truth. The country was divided. Trust in leadership was at an all-time low. People no longer believed in politicians and institutions, in the system itself. If Barron Trump truly believed in leadership, in responsibility, then what did he see as the solution? This was a defining moment. Barron had skillfully deflected, countered, and redirected throughout the interview. But this was different. This was not about his past, his father, or even his personal ambitions. This was about America itself. The silence in the room stretched long. The weight of the question was undeniable. Caldwell had finally asked something that demanded an answer. Barron did not hesitate. His response was not a speech, not a rehearsed political statement. It was something else entirely. It was a challenge. He made it clear that America did not need another politician promising change. It did not need empty slogans or scripted unity. What it needed was accountability from its leaders, from its institutions, but most of all, from its people. No single person, no single president could fix what was broken. The power to change a nation did not rest in the hands of one individual. It rested in the hands of every citizen. The room was silent, not because the audience was unsure of how to react, but because they had just heard something unexpected. Barron Trump was not selling an idea. He was forcing a reality check. He was not offering himself as a solution. He was reminding America that the solution had never been one person, but the will of the people. It was a response unlike anything Caldwell had ever heard. For the first time in his career, he had no immediate follow-up. The audience erupted into applause, not polite, not obligatory, but the kind of applause that comes when people hear something that shifts their perspective. And Caldwell knew in that moment that he had lost the final battle. There were no more angles to exploit, no more traps to set. Barron Trump had not only won the interview, he had changed its very nature. He had taken what was meant to be an interrogation and transformed it into a defining moment, not just for himself, but for the way America saw him. This was no longer just a discussion about a last name. This was the emergence of a figure who had stepped out of the shadow of legacy and into his own light. Barron Trump had not made a declaration of political ambition. He had made a statement of purpose, and America had listened. The moment was unlike anything the studio had ever witnessed. The applause had not faded into a simple reaction. It had solidified into something greater: respect, recognition, a shift in perception that would ripple far beyond the walls of that room. Richard Caldwell, a man known for breaking down the most powerful figures in America, sat across from Barron Trump in stunned silence. He had gone into this interview believing he would be the one shaping the conversation, the one dictating the direction of the discussion. But now the reality was undeniable. Barron Trump had taken the reins. He had defined himself on his own terms. For years, the world had speculated about who he was, what he thought, what role, if any, he would play in the grander stage of history. And now, without making any direct declarations, without aligning himself to anyone's expectations, he had given his answer. He was not just a name, not just a legacy. He was his own force. Caldwell finally broke the silence, his voice softer now, carrying something unexpected: respect. The interview was no longer a battle. It was no longer an attempt to unravel Barron Trump. It had evolved into something else, a moment of clarity not just for the audience, but for Caldwell himself. For the first time, the seasoned journalist admitted what millions had just come to realize. Barron Trump was not just another political figure's son. He was something different, something new, something America had not fully grasped until now. The final moments of the interview unfolded with an energy unlike anything seen before. The cameras captured the faces in the audience, some still processing what they had just witnessed, others already understanding that this moment would be replayed, analyzed, and discussed for years to come. The show ended. The cameras powered down, but the conversation was only just beginning. The media would dissect every second of the interview. Headlines would flood every news outlet. Political analysts would debate whether this was the beginning of something larger, whether Barron Trump had just set the stage for an entirely new chapter in American history. But Barron himself, he simply stood, shook Caldwell's hand, and walked off the stage. Not with the weight of expectation on his shoulders, but with the confidence of a man who had just proven he was no longer defined by anyone else's story. This interview had not answered the question of what was next for Barron Trump. Instead, it had left America with a far bigger question. Was this just the beginning? And as the world continued to talk, to speculate, to wonder, one thing was now certain. Barron Trump had arrived, and America would never look at him the same way again. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing stories. Make sure you subscribe to our channel, that way you'll never miss our newest uploads.